Okay, this PowerPoint is going to talk about comedic narrative. This will be important. It's going to be the topic for the last paper that you write for English 250, and it'll be the framework through which we understand William Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream. When we think of comedic narrative, a lot of times folks want to think about something that's going to be funny. And in fact, in Shakespeare's play, there's a lot of funny stuff. There's some slapstick comedy. Uh, there's a lot of verbal puns. There's a lot to make the audience laugh, but that's not what makes it a comedy. Instead, I want us to think about comedy as that's about reconciliation. And I'm going to define comedy as a mythology of reconciliation because I want us to understand it as something which is culturally very important. You remember when we talked about mythology, we were talking about those stories around which cultures are organized. Comedy, and this will become clear as we learn more about it. Comedy, in some ways, uh, is one of the principal mythologies of our culture. It's a way that we not only organize narratives that we read and watch, but it's also the way that we understand our own experiences. And what I want you to understand is that comedy is at its heart about bringing together things that are different. We will find when we're looking at Shakespeare's plays that comedy is about a reconciliation of genders, uh, as it is in a lot of romantic comedies where we have to line up the boys and the girls because they're meant to be married. But it's also about reconciling different cultures, as we'll see with Theseus and Hippolyta. And it's about reconciling different generations, as we'll see with some of the young lovers and their parents. So I want us to think of comedy as being about reconciliation. A phrase that you might want to remember, and it's not one that I'm going to test you on, but it's one that's important, is from a critic named C.L. Barber, who wrote a book called Shakespeare's Festive Comedies. Barber wrote that book back in the 1950s, but it's still relevant and people still use it. The phrase that I would ask you to remember is through release to clarification. That's the phrase that Barber uses to describe the journey that the characters within comedies undergo. They move through release, and that release, as we'll talk about, is going to be a release of their identities towards a kind of clarification. As Barber discusses this phrase, it really has three parts. The first is tension, the second is release, and the third is clarification. You're going to want to remember those because you're going to have to write about each of them in your final paper. Let's talk a little bit more about them. Tension is going to be the first part of the narrative. In the tension phase, we're going to find the characters are living with something that's wrong in their lives. There's something that's blocking them from being who they're meant to be or doing what they are meant to do. If it's a romantic comedy, and in some way Shakespeare's play is a romantic comedy, we're going to have lovers who are separated from each other by some force, and it might be an external force like parents who are getting in the way. It might be an internal force like there's something that's preventing them from recognizing the person that they're supposed to be in love with. We know that they're meant to be together, but we also know that there's something that's blocking them, and we can see that they're so close, but something's just not quite right. And if we think about what we might do in our own lives when we're under a great deal of tension, is we'll try to get away from it. And very often that's what these characters are going to do. And that's the second phase of the comedic pattern. Release. The characters will try to escape from whatever is causing them tension. That might mean that they inadvertently separate themselves from the person that they're meant to be with. It might mean that they run away. It might mean that they go on some kind of a vacation, but they'll do something to release themselves from their circumstances. And what they don't realize is that they're also releasing themselves from their identities. When the characters are going through the release phase, what we'll very often see is they will lose everything that they have ever known about themselves. They'll go through, in many ways, the darkest parts of their lives. They will experience tremendous loss and confusion. Now, very often in a romantic comedy, we'll actually be laughing during this part of this part of the movie, and we do that not because we are cruel, horrible people, but rather because we know at the end that everything is going to be okay. We know that things are going to reach a reconciliation. We know that the boy and girl who are meant to be together are going to end up together. But something has to happen first. They have to lose everything before they can gain that reconciliation. When they finally have lost everything, then we're the third part, the clarification. This is the part where things will resolve themselves. We get to the end. If it's a typical romantic comedy, it may end in marriage or the promise of marriage, and we'll be told that the characters live happily ever after. They have gone through their trials, they've gone through the bad experiences. Somehow they have grown from those experiences, and now they have been reborn, and they're ready to live the lives that they were always meant to live. This is the story, as I told you, of romantic comedies. It's a story that we'll see played out in three different narrative circuits in Shakespeare's play. It's also, I want to suggest to you, the story of almost everything within our culture. It's how we understand our own loss, it's how we understand our own failures. It's the narrative pattern of conversion stories. It's a narrative pattern of spiritual autobiographies. It's the narrative pattern of just about every sitcom, every comedy, every romance, every movie that we've ever watched. Let's think of a couple of examples. Okay, so I told you it's the story of everything. Uh, Once upon a time, there was a young man, very smart. He was born in North Africa, and he showed great intellectual promise, but he also showed a great willingness to do all of the wrong things. While he should have been studying, he was spending too much of his time drinking and hanging around the wrong sorts of young fellows who were getting him into all kinds of trouble. He also started hanging around with the wrong kinds of women. In fact, he fathered a child out of wedlock when he was very young. His life was going in such a bad direction that his mother, Monica, would later become the patron saint of mothers of difficult children. Well, eventually, this young fellow moves out of North Africa, and first he goes to Rome, and then he ends up in Milan, where he's working as a rhetoric teacher. This would have been about the equivalent of an English composition teacher. He's doing well with his students, but he's still living a life that's not the life that he should be living. And like a lot of young people, while he seems to be having a great time partying, he's really trying to compensate for an emptiness that's gnawing at his heart. This starts to grow, and eventually he reaches a point of despair. He's in his home. He walks out into the garden, and remember, this is a spiritual autobiography, so gardens are going to play important roles. He walks out into his garden. He's looking for guidance, and he hears a voice. It's probably the voice of a boy next door who's just chanting, Tolle lege, take up and read. So he goes inside and he opens the first book that he comes to. It's the Bible. And he opens it randomly, and it goes to a chapter of Romans. I think it's chapter 13, where the text advises him to give up his sinful ways and to stop living a life of pleasure and instead turn to God. At that point, he realizes everything that he's done wrong, and he becomes reborn and goes on to become St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the really important church fathers, and one of the great intellectuals to whom Christians today owe a lot of their theological tradition. And we can see in that autobiography that he recorded, one of the first autobiographies that we have, we can see the tension of him living a life that he's not supposed to live. We can see the release when he gives up his identity and he looks for guidance and looks for assistance where he's never looked for it before. And then we can find the clarification as the sinner is reborn as the saint. And in fact, as we look through Christian narratives, whether we're thinking of the story of Saul on the road to Damascus, undergoing an experience of death, of the blinding and falling off his horse, and then being reborn as Paul, or whether we're thinking of any of the saints' lives, we can find the same pattern of tension, release, and clarification. But it's not just in spiritual autobiographies. Let's think of maybe some of the stories that you grew up. Oh, there's Belle. And Belle, we know right in the beginning, is living in a great deal of tension because she's way too smart for this small provincial town, and she really wants to read and learn and study, and nobody seems to understand her. And there's that brutish fellow, Gustave, who wants to marry her, but he's exactly the wrong sort of fellow. That's the tension. And then when her father gets himself into trouble because he always seems to be doing that, she has to leave that small town and she enters a world of great uncertainty and of great danger, very much like the world that we'll see the characters in the Midsummer Night's Dream enter when they leave Athens and go into the forest. And there she undergoes a great deal of personal danger, and she also has to release herself from the certainty that she once had and risk her own well being in order to save her father. In the end, through her sacrifice, she is able to redeem her father, and in fact, she is reborn, and the beast himself becomes reborn through her love, and they're able to live happily ever after. There's tension, release, and then clarification. And at the end, the promise that they will live happily ever after. Going back to a movie that scared us all when I was a kid, we find young Dorothy, very much like Belle. She's way too smart for the place that she's living, in her case, rural Kansas. And what's more, nobody's really paying any attention to her. Remember, Auntie Em and Uncle Henry don't really seem to have any time for her. All the guys working on the farm are too busy. She dreams of something better for herself, that place over the rainbow, and she really seems very lonely and very sad. All she has for company is her little dog Toto. And that dog is threatened by that evil woman who owns half the county, who wants to kill Toto. So what does she do with all that tension? Well, she runs away. She goes through a period of release. The first time she does it physically. Remember, she grabs Toto, she puts him in a little basket, and she runs away, and then she runs into uh, the professor who works with the carnivals, and he looks into his crystal ball and he says, "Oh no, you got to go back home. Everybody's worried about you." Well, she goes back home, and what happens? Well, the tornado's coming. Everybody else has disappeared. They're hiding down in the cellar. She goes inside, then the window gets blown out and it knocks her unconscious, and she enters into a dream world. When she's in that dream world, we notice everything's been reversed. All of a sudden, she's not the smallest, least significant person, but she's in the land of those creepy munchkins, and she's the smallest, or she's the smartest, and physically the biggest person, and she's the one who has gone from powerlessness to power. She has released herself from her old identity and then embraced a new identity, one that puts her in a position of power and authority. But that new identity, remember, the release stage is never going to be a happy stage. It's always a time of increasing danger. And in fact, she encounters more and more danger as she travels through the land of Oz, eventually reaching Oz only to discover that the great wizard can't bring her home. In the end, we know it's not the ruby slippers, and we'll talk about this as we get further into the play. It's not the ruby slippers that bring her home. She's always had the power. All she has to do is wish herself back home and say, "There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home." Then she comes back. She wakes up from her dream. And now the tension that marked the beginning is resolved because all the other characters are paying attention to her. And she has been, in a sense, reborn. The same little girl who wanted to travel over the rainbow now tells her Auntie Em and Uncle Henry that she'll never want to travel any further than her own backyard. Keep that story in mind too. We're going to have to talk about that as we get to the end of this play as well. But you see tension, release, and clarification. I'll give one more quick example. Once upon a time, there's a young woman. In fact, she's a princess, and there's tension in her life because she doesn't have any prince to marry. So she picks up a frog and she kisses the frog, and the frog turns into the handsome prince, and they marry and live happily ever after. That's the way we tell the story. But there's actually a part that's missing, and I guess they have to leave it out of the children's books, because if they put it in the children's books, my guess is we'd have a lot of little girls not only kissing frogs, but also hurting them. In the actual fairy tale, she picks up the frog and kisses it, just like in the stories we tell our kids. But then she takes the frog and she hurls it against a wall. I'm serious, she does. She throws it against the wall with such force that the frog splits open. In fact, its heart splits open, and then the prince emerges. The tension, release, and clarification is on the frog's part. Tension, he's living his life as a frog. The release, that loss, notice in that story, like in the story of Saul on the road to Damascus, is a story of death and rebirth. The old self has to die before the new self can be reborn. That young girl, Dorothy, the one who dreamed of going over the rainbow, at the end of the story, when she's saying she'll never want to wander any further than her own backyard, that little girl's gone forever. There's a sadness in the story as much as there is a comic resolution at the end. And we're going to have to keep that in mind as well. The story of comedy, this three-part of tension, release, and clarification, is a story of growth through loss. Back just about 1,000,000 years ago when I was in graduate school, one of my professors wanted to illustrate this idea by drawing a squiggly line on the board, which I've tried to recreate for you in the bottom part of this slide. The first line, the one that's going across horizontally, that's the tension part. The characters are getting by in their lives, but they're not really going anywhere. Something's preventing them from being who they need to be. The release is the downward line. This is where things are going bad, where they're losing their identity. They've gone into the woods thinking that things are going to get better, but things are really just getting worse. And then they hit a kind of rock bottom. The clarification is the line going upwards. Back many years ago when I was teaching at a small school in Missouri, a lot of my students were part of an alcohol and drug studies program. Most of those students were recovering addicts, and they were in college learning to become counselors so that they could help other people overcome their addictions. Whenever I taught this to them and I drew the line, they'd all nod and say, "Oh, man, that is the story of an addict's life. You're going through, things are kind of okay. You think you're able to control your addiction, but then things start spinning out of control. Now you're going in a downward cycle. You're in that period of release where you're losing everything. You hit rock bottom, and at that point you have a choice. You can either recover or you can die. And if you recover, your life gets infinitely better as you learn to overcome your addiction and you enter recovery. But you can only get there if you've hit rock bottom. The only way to grow, the only way to get past that point where you are, past that tension, is through loss. I want you to think about this narrative pattern. Think about how we make sense in our own culture, in our own experience of those times when we failed, those times when we've tried to do something and we haven't been successful. Watch how we turn those experiences into narratives of growth. It's how we understand things. This is, in some ways, the foundational mythology, or at least a foundational mythology of our culture. It's how we learn, it's how we grow, it's how we write the narratives of our own life. Now let's think about going back to what we'll be talking about in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Let's think about the idea of comedy within romantic comedies, which, as I've said, often uh, result in marriage or the promise of marriage, as we'll see when we get to the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream. So let's think about marriage and reconciliation. Part of what needs to be reconciled in these narratives is young people they're acting like young people. They're not thinking straight. Uh, Anthropologists sometimes will say that civilizations that learn to manage and control youthful sexual desire will be successful. Civilizations that don't learn to manage and control youthful sexual desire will not be successful. Now, those same anthropologists will tell us that there are a lot of different needs that different civilizations have with different resources in different times. So there may be different ways that they will manage that desire. Within Western culture, at least since at, at, at least since the medieval times, that youthful desire will be managed through monogamous marriage. Marriage becomes, in fact, a way of reconciling youthful desire. And boy, we'll see that with these four lovers they're just teenagers who are having crushes on each other, but they're all kind of in love with the wrong people, and the whole thing's a mess. They need to grow up. They need to go through an experience of loss so that they can fulfill the role that they have to fulfill within Athens and within their culture. They have a role to play. And a lot of times students don't like thinking in this way, and it's certainly not a very romantic way of thinking, but they need to get married so that they can have the children to replace the old folks who are dying. Marriage and the promise of children becomes a way of reconciling new life with the inevitability of death. We'll see as we're reading through A Midsummer Night's Dream that even while it's lighthearted and there's all this funny stuff going on and all these kids running around and making all these jokes, and sometimes they're kind of dirty jokes, there's also a lot of imagery of death. And in fact, death is ever present within the text as it is in society. The only earthly way that those characters can fight against death is through the creation of new life, through that continuation. That's in large part what comedy is about. That's where comedy is about reconciling society and reconciling generations. And I'll give you a hint. They don't live happily ever after. And I don't mean this as a cynical statement, but instead what we'll find is that the characters end in marriage, and that's not a promise of happily ever after, but it's rather an acceptance of the responsibilities that come with adulthood. Just as young Dorothy has to put aside the youthful dreams that she had of traveling over the rainbow so that she can accept the role that she's supposed to accept, these young lovers at the end aren't going to live a life of perpetual joy. Instead, they'll live a life that has all of the challenges of being an adult, all the challenges of being parents. They will be reconciled, they'll grow up, but it's going to be a growth through loss. And just like in that fairy tale where the frog has to be thrown against the wall and his heart has to break open, the frog has to die before the prince can emerge. The story of comedy, tension, release, and clarification, is always going to be a story of growth through loss and a story of loss. Okay, that's what we'll be talking about when we are talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream, and it's what you're going to be writing about. Uh, I hope this all makes more sense as we go forward, and we'll see what we can learn. Take care, guys.